Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report Daily podcast. I'm your host, Bhaga Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Later in the program, our conversation with Tom Mankin of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments about his new paper about how to structure the United States for prolonged great power competition. But first, I'm joined by my producer, Chris Cervello, and we're going to talk a little bit about some key takeaways for the week. Chris, thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, Vaga, thank you very much. As we've been working our way through these daily podcasts, we both agreed that taking a little bit of time at the end of the week to kind of look back on things that we heard and saw, as well as look ahead to next week, might be beneficial, certainly for us, but also for the audience.
First, thanks very much for your great support. We couldn't have done what we did without you, and look forward to continuing to bring updates for the audience as everybody's sort of trapped at home, working from home, which raises a whole series of challenges as well.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. Let's jump right into it, though. What caught your attention? I mean, you have the benefit of speaking to a number of distinguished guests this week.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's, kind of effectively been in lockdown, and we're fortunate because we can do what we do remotely.
Right.
Folks are consuming the podcast, so it doesn't really matter where we are in producing. And I thought the most interesting thing was how many people were out and about and not really observing what appeared to be distance, even though I think that folks at a very senior level are hitting the panic button, and that includes the president, that for a long time was saying that, that this will go away on its own. I thought that was interesting, that the messaging, the alarmist tone driven by healthcare professionals who are worried about worst case scenarios, that message was not penetrating clearly to a segment of the population. That was kind of an interesting moment. I think the other interesting thing is how serious this issue of lawmakers insider trading. I think the combination of somebody of Bob Burr's reputation as being sort of a really upstanding member of the Senate, being caught up in allegations of insider trading that may have yielded him a tidy windfall. And then Georgia Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler also being accused of the same thing is highly problematic at a time when faith and trust in government is already running low. I think that those are, and surely there are likely more people. And I also understand people with the moral concern. We discussed this briefly on the Thursday podcast, right? The concern that these guys were, that lawmakers, some of whom were poo-pooing the notion of alarm, had been briefed, and a month ago were briefing their biggest donors, as Senator Burr was caught on tape with donors at the Capitol Hill Club, that's the Republican club in Washington, D.C. for lawmakers, telling some of his biggest donors, hey, this is going to get bad, and effectively prepare accordingly for it. I can't imagine anybody who left that meeting not calling their broker or their financial advisor and saying, you got to liquidate me because this is going to be, or, I got to get out of stuff, protect me. I think that that's something that the average American certainly doesn't have.
Well, this seems to have grabbed the attention of, influencers like yourself. Tucker Carlson really went apoplectic in his top of the show segment where he offers additional opinion. I mean, he called for Burr to resign and others that were involved to resign. Do you think that momentum builds and something happens, or amongst all the crisis and up and down of the coronavirus, this falls away?
I think that it builds. I think that it gives. Now, look, I mean, you're going to have to see who gets caught up in it, right? I mean, if senior Democrats get caught up in this, just as these Republicans have gotten caught up in it, it's pox on the whole house. If it's predominantly in one party over another, then it's potentially really problematic for the party who gets caught up in this. And then that may have implications in November, right? I mean, we're still a long time out, and a lot can happen between now and then.
What else are you tracking for Monday's World Market podcast?
The entire discussion is what sort of a rebound there's going to be at the end of the day, right? I mean, we know, how bad is this going to be, right? So is this something that's no worse than an average flu season, in part because we are taking these precautions right now? I mean, this is a particularly dangerous strain of flu. So the fact that some people have been involved and didn't get sick, there are people who have no idea who they got in contact with. and they're very, very sick, and they can't get tested, right? I mean, the big difference between the United States and other parts of the world is we're not testing. So we have no idea who's been exposed. And then there are people who likely have it and are still not being able to be tested, directly infecting a lot of, so I mean, I think a lot of our policies, I mean, this goes to my thinking that fundamentally, we just don't know as humanity what we're doing, because a lot of what we do is predicated on what we've done before, or sort of somewhat arbitrary protocols or approaches. I understand that we are invoking the Defense Production Act, but I would submit that if a shortage of respirators and ventilators may be the factor between getting care and surviving or dying quietly at home, as has been the case sadly in Europe, one would imagine we would mobilize somehow and produce more of these devices, and then, donate them around the world if we don't need them, right? Or keep them in strategic reserve. We don't know what the next pandemic is going to be. So it just sort of strikes me, where is the market going? What's next? Where we go with some of these economic plans, which may at the end of the day be very, very costly, may give help to those maybe in greatest need, but then raise a whole bunch of questions, again, traditionally about what government's role is in getting involved in calamities like this. I think getting involved is critical. Putting money into the economy is critical. I think that anybody who thinks that rampant government spending has not contributed to economic prosperity over the last couple of years probably needs to reconsider. I mean, we were putting $500 billion more into the economy through deficit spending over the last couple of years than we were in 2016. I don't know about you, but I think 500 billion is a pretty nice piece of change, and it did buoy people. So
beyond Monday, what else are you watching for the week? I mean, you hit on some of it, but anything that you missed, a week out that you're going to keep an eye on?
Well, I mean, look, it's more broadly how the political debate goes. How does defense preparedness go? I know you've got some thoughts on this that are really, really very insightful. I mean, I'm sort of surprised how slow the response from the Pentagon has been in many respects, right? That we haven't been hearing as much from senior leaders, or that folks who have had press conferences have been talking about sort of narrow slices of it. I should be flipping that question around to you. What are some of the things, what are some of your observations, especially about how DoD has responded?
As we were talking about before we came on, I'm really surprised how long it's taken the Pentagon to, one, get its talking points right, and two, to get things moving in the right direction. I mean, if you buy into the fact that we've had this national defense strategy where we've been focused on great power competition, at the centerpiece of that, in addition to kind of building the military and being prepared to deal with China and Russia, there was this idea that something bad could happen and that we should be prepared for that, whether that is on the kinetic side or whether it was on the non-kinetic, like cyber or something like that. The fact that the Pentagon didn't spring into action and at least appear to be prepared for what we're dealing with is very surprising to me. It has taken senior leaders across all the services several days and almost weeks to be out in front of the story. I was just, before we started talking, was watching Chief of Naval Operations video that he put out to the force, and Admiral Gilday, I mean, he said all the right things, and I mean, he is he puts out a very confident appearance. But the fact that it's really, 10 days into this before he's kind of out front and center, and I think you could put other leaders in that exact same camp, I'm just really surprised by the guidance that's gone out to the individual units, and I can only really speak for the Navy on this side. I'm really surprised that we're as behind on this. That you mentioned yesterday that it's going to take weeks to a month to get the hospital ships moving. I mean, we should have been and should be ready for this type of crisis. And what I worry about is, lastly, I worry that we're not going to learn all the lessons that we need to learn from something like this. So I hope that there's somebody on some staff writing all these lessons down, because in 2 or 3 or 4 years, I mean, whether it's a virus or whether it's a cyber attack, or God forbid, whether it's an attack on the homeland, we're going to go through the same types of issues that we're going through right now. And I hope we're better prepared the next time we face this.
It's as you said, right? I mean, it also, you don't want to sound harsh, and I apologize to anybody in the audience who might take this the wrong way, but it's sort of the softness of the population, right? I mean, you can't even sit still in your place. You can't even not party. You can't even avoid, take seriously what's going on, right? And adequately prepare. The other thing I think that's sort of critical in all of this, I think, is the notion of not squandering time. You and I have talked about this a lot, and it's a theme that I think is the most consistent theme, that at the end of the day, it's about leadership. Leadership is about moving quickly with as much alacrity as you can to solve major problems, whether they're at your doorstep or whether you can see them on the horizon. And the problem is that time and again, we haven't moved with the alacrity we need to move with to address some of these challenges. There's no way the DoD intelligence was not picking up incinerators disposing of bodies in Wuhan, right? Intelligence indicated there was something going on. So that would have been a good time to say, holy moly, what does that mean? What are the things we need to do? How do we inform our allies? How do we organize collective action against it? As opposed to, holy crap, we don't want to unsettle the stock market, so we won't say anything, right? I mean, the administration has put guidance out to states, like, don't report your unemployment claims, because that's going to scare the market. The market already got scared that the Fed has basically emptied its magazine of potential actions, and it didn't move the market at all. So, I mean, that's the thing, is if you move early, you can nip it in the bud, and it's better for people to say, wow, that was an overreaction that avoided a calamity, as opposed to everybody sitting around and going like, well, now what? Now we're in the teeth of a calamity. And we've seen this, whether it's for cyber. We know exactly how the Chinese and Russians are going to fight us, and yet we still haven't adapted our strategy and are really focused on sort of more yesterday's system and the role they may have, as opposed to the reality of how adversaries will fight us, which will be through hybrid, which will be through cyber. That's not to say you don't need the traditional kinetic capabilities either, but they may be somewhat less relevant than the networks and the individual pieces that some of these adversaries will target. So I think that this is sort of it's a broad wake-up call. Urgency matters, leadership matters, focus matters, priorities matter. And I hope that that's what everybody comes out of this with.
For the interest of time, that's probably a good spot to leave it for this week. And I think it's a nice tee up for the conversation that you're going to have with Tom Mencken as he looks at thinking about and dealing with a long great power competition.
Chris, thanks very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Vago.
And joining us now is Tom Mencken, PhD, the president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, one of the nation's leading think tanks, and author of an important new report, Forging the Tools of 21st Century Great Power Competition. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Vago, always a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Have enjoyed our conversations. And I know that we spoke at the Reagan Forum. I think it was in late 2018, where you said you were actually working on this piece. So congratulations on giving it birth in terms of how to align all of these great power tools that we have at our disposal, given that adversary nations like China and Russia, like many authoritarian systems, are somewhat more joined up than we are. And there's been a lot of talk about better integrating America's diplomatic, economic, military, and cultural power. You're looking at that. What are some of the key takeaways from the report? How do we need to think about this space to help us think through how we have to organize ourselves? And what are the lessons from the Cold War, perhaps, that we should rekindle?
Yeah, thanks, Vago. I mean, I think the first thing is to realize that competition with the Soviet Union during the Cold War was very broad and touched on a whole number of areas that we don't even think about, when we think about, frankly, there are areas that we don't even think about when we think back to the Cold War, let alone areas that we think about in the 21st century. So if we look at the instruments of great power competition during the Cold War, it included not only military instruments and diplomatic instruments like our alliances, and not just armaments and arms control, but also science, technology, and innovation, the economy, political warfare, and even for a period, internal security, where we were intensely concerned about Soviet subversion of the United States. So I think the first lesson to take from it is just how broad in scope the US competition with the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. Another thing to take from it too is that many of those instruments are still around, although maybe they've been repurposed in a number of cases. Others were done away with, and maybe we need to think at least about those functions, if not exactly about replicating exact institutions from the Cold War.
You mentioned there are things to pick up from the Cold War, and you thoughtfully note that it's that 3 decades since the Cold War is a professional lifetime, and that only the most senior-most leaders remember that era. On the other hand, they remember it from the perspective of junior officers, not senior leaders, who are the ones who are actually making those decisions. How do you inculcate that sense of urgency, focus, and strategic mindedness that was common then, and common in a very bipartisan fashion? How do we need to all think about this to get to where we need to be?
Yeah, Vago, that's a great question. First, I think we are fortunate that we still have with us some folks, and by and large, they are senior leaders that have this experience in their personal memory. Now, of course, that can both inform and misinform, right? But I do think that it really is incumbent upon the leadership to really drive things, because I think if you read the Trump administration's national security strategy, you read the most recent national defense strategy, there is an acknowledgement that we are in a period of great power competition. And national security strategy correctly characterizes it as a multi-dimensional competition. But I think that understanding, is still percolating down, percolating from some of the senior levels to, the mid levels of the bureaucracy, percolating out, if you will, from sort of the core of the national security community out to other parts of the national security community, and percolating out from Washington, D.C. to other parts of the country. And I think it's absolutely true that those who are really concerned about this issue, in government, have one set of views, and then other parts of the government, other parts of the population, have very different views. Although I think those views are evolving over time. I think the reality of competition and the reality of multidimensional competition, I think, is apparent to more and more people across the country every day.
So to follow up on that point, though, right? Leadership matters. The National Defense Strategy is a great document, and if you look at it, the National Security Strategy is a great document. The question is how you implement that and make sure that the president's rhetoric, for example, aligns with the messages that are coming out of Congress that are also reflected across the diplomatic, military, cultural, economic arms of government. And that's distinctly not the case. How important is it that the leader and leaders be all integrated in this message? Because in our case, all the money is sort of poured into the Pentagon as if that's the most important element of this, or the only important element of this, whereas the other arms seem remarkably uncoordinated.
Perhaps, although I do think there's been movement in a positive direction. And I think this is an area where the Trump administration deserves some credit. Past administrations, Democrat or Republican, were divided when it came to China, as probably the best example, between those who took a zero-sum view of Sino-American relations and those who took a positive-sum view, right? So, if you will, sort of the national security folks and the economic commerce folks, right? And whether you're talking about Democratic administration or Republican administration, and across administrations, you had very different views of the US-China relationship. I think one of the things that's characterized the Trump administration is that across the national security community, broadly construed in the Trump administration, there's a shared view and a correct view in my view that the U.S.-China relationship basically is a zero-sum relationship across not just the military sphere, but also diplomatic, economic, ideological. So I do think, at least in this administration, you have a group of senior leaders that have more of a common view of the challenge posed by China than their predecessors did in previous administrations. And I think that's very important.
But having the common view and making sure that you're actually daily making more friends than you're alienating people is equally critical to that. All of our allies, for example, are convinced, having had conversations at very senior levels across folks from Asia, that the most important thing for the president was getting a trade deal and getting China to buy more agricultural products or industrial products. But actually, they're more convinced than ever that, for example, the United States will not come to bat for them, which explains some of the decisions that they're all making. So how do we need to do this in sort of an integrated fashion, given that our ability to deter, shape whatever China, even in a zero-sum context, will intimately depend on our allies?
Yeah, well, one of the things that becomes apparent when you go back and look at the Cold War as it unfolded, and you look at the creation of these instruments of competition during the Cold War, one of the things that becomes apparent is that didn't occur overnight. That was an effort that spanned administrations. It was an effort that was characterized by both, one might say, earthquakes and tremors. I mean, earthquakes were, big events. If you want to think about a Sputnik moment or a reaction to a big geopolitical event, and the tremors were waves of institution creation that generally accorded with the inauguration of a new presidential administration. So what looks in retrospect to have been rapid, effortless, marked by an enormous amount of bipartisanship, upon further scrutiny, turns out to be none of those things. There were plenty of controversies back then, right? Controversies over the role of the U.S. government, the role of government in people's private lives, the role of the government in the economy, and those debates really did shape the instruments for Cold War competition. So, and in ways that that worked against sound planning. The deeply held anti-statism of the American people, for example, got in the way of planning for protracted war and planning for national economic mobilization. When it comes to allies, again, if you look at, we tend to think of the alliances that were formed and have persisted. And I think with good reason, because those tend to be alliances that where the seeds of alliance fell on fertile soil, where there were some real cultural affinities, political affinities. There was a lot of background to those alliances. We should also remember that there was a whole other set of alliances that didn't persist, and so we should realize that it wasn't perfect back then. It was a protracted process. There were some false starts. Things didn't get done overnight, but there's still a lot that we can learn from it, including just that that very insight.
So what are the next steps, right? So if you're trying to get this to senior policymakers, if you were going to give them the pitch, what are the first three things we've got to do right away?
First is to open up our lens, right? When we think about competition, we need to think not just about military measures, not just about diplomatic measures. We really need to think about science, technology, innovation, the economy, political warfare and countering political warfare, and we need to think very, very seriously about those things. Second, you already alluded to this. This can't be just a discussion within the Beltway or within the Acela corridor, right? This really does have to be a national discussion. And I think, quite honestly, one of the silver linings of the COVID cloud may be getting people to question, some of the assumptions that we've been holding, whether it's about our supply chains and the security of our supply chains, whether it's about how democratic governments respond to challenges as opposed to how authoritarian governments respond, a whole bunch of things like that. And finally, I'd say, while there are a lot of differences between then and now, and we shouldn't draw too many direct analogies, there also are a fair amount of similarities. So we don't want to overlearn the lessons of history, but I think we want to be mindful of them as we move forward.
And one of the big differences is China is an economic superpower. That wasn't the case with the Soviet Union. And China is also a lot more cunning in some ways on how it uses influence, right? I mean, using the coronavirus began in China, but it's Beijing that's actually reached out to Italy, Iran, South Korea, and other nations with aid. I mean, even offering aid to the United States, right? So they are working this messaging top to bottom.
They are, but also in some throwbacks to the Cold War as well, right? So there's as you say, there's the softer side of Chinese political and economic influence. There's also the political warfare side of it, right? Which is saying that to refer to coronavirus as coming out of Wuhan is racist. It's now, the allegations going around that, well, no, this was an American virus. It was actually the U.S. military that created this virus. And again, it's shades of the Soviet campaign, Soviet active measures, alleging that AIDS was created by the United States, right?
Right.
So past and the present, they don't rhyme, but they do at least harmonize with one another.
They do indeed. Tom, thanks so very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Vago.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this week. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly Cyber Report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we hope everybody has a very happy and very safe weekend.